Hello, welcome to my channel Art Book Nook. My name is Kay and I review art and craft books. Today I'm going to review a book published by Dorling Kindersley, Watercolour Techniques for Artists and Illustrators. This book is sort of a compendium, a bit like a pick and mix. There are 256 quality pages with contributions from about 15 different artists. Dorling Kindersley produce absolutely beautiful books. I've never come across a bad one yet, so I'm looking forward to seeing what this contains. So the book is split into various sections. We've got basics, such as why watercolour, watercolour paint, etc. Techniques, which are split into 3 sections: beginner techniques, intermediate techniques and advanced techniques. And then different subjects, such as landscapes and townscapes, patterns, still life flowers, portraits, figures and animals. So we start with the basics. Why watercolour? A lot of people who are new to painting start out with watercolour and they often give up and fail because they fail to learn the basic techniques of how to control it, which is fundamental really to using it. But the basic techniques section in this book will show you just how. And there's a statement here that says, "Every watercolour is an adventure, an exciting journey into the unknown." Well, you can say that again, can't you? I think that's the most exciting thing about watercolour. Moving on, watercolour paint, getting to know your pigments. What is watercolour? Pans versus tubes. There's also a little bit on the pigment numbering system and discussion about pure colours and hues. Other water-based media is discussed. Book looks at inks and liquid watercolours, watercolour pencils and crayons and gouache, paper and other supports. What is watercolour paper? All about surface texture and the paper's weight and the different formats you could purchase watercolour paper in. There's also an illustration on this on the left hand side about the different effects you get with different textured paper. That's a really good one actually. If you like to use a lot of dry brushwork, then you're better off with a rough surface to work on. And if you like to paint something like translucent flowers or botanical work, then you're better off with a smooth surface. Moves on to brushes, talks about the different brush shapes, applying paint, exploring different paint effects and brush strokes. Techniques such as stamping and sponging, splattering, that's a very popular technique at the moment for texture, pencils and pens, and different mediums, and then water-soluble graphite. Observational skills, which is the art of seeing what will work in a painting, in other words, finding a point of interest, looking for shapes, repetitive shapes, and cropping what you see, using your artistic license. We have some very helpful information about perspective and composition, how to portray a 3-dimensional space. There are just a few pages in this book illustrating perspective and different compositional shapes. If you'd like to learn more, there's a very comprehensive book called Mastering Composition by an artist called Ian Roberts, and I've reviewed this book, so I'll put a link in the description below. So you can go and look at it if that's something that's interesting to you. Drawing basics is about portraying scale and proportions. There's a section on measuring from life, measuring figures and looking for relationships. I found this particularly useful. I've never come across this before, the technique that's been illustrated in this book. It's something I shall certainly use for myself going forward. The sketching and planning pages are really helpful, and it's something that I come across time and time again when I'm a professional watercolour artist, and actually any professional artist, the importance of sketching to capture the essence of what it is you're trying to paint, and the importance of planning your work before you begin. At the bottom of this 2-page spread, there is an example of from real life to a painting, the steps taken. So number 1, the photo is a photograph of the actual scene. Number 2 is a tonal study, which is very important if you're going to get contrast and light into your final piece. The preparatory sketch, and the final painting. And there's a side note that says you'll learn more from a single sketch than from taking 100 photographs. A lot of artists always carry a sketchbook with them and a little tiny sort of portable watercolour set, little palette set, to make colour notes. And I think if you're going to grow as an artist, I think it's really important that you try and adopt this practice. The next few pages are devoted to colour theory and understanding colour relationships and tone. So we've got the basic painter's colour wheel with primary, secondary and tertiary colours, and then a discussion about tone and how to adjust the tone of watercolour, which is basically adding more water to lighten it, but that is something that you need to control. We then have properties of colour, learning more about how colours work, colour temperature and bias. So some colours are warmer, for example an olive green is a warm green, and some are cooler, so that would be more of a bluey green like a fir tree. And then we have colour harmony, which is where colours they can either harmonise or they can clash. So there's some illustrations on colour harmony. We have pigment properties. Certain pigments in watercolour will granulate, which means they sort of split slightly and they create a mottled effect, and then certain watercolours will stain more than others, and some watercolour pigments are more light fast than others. So all these considerations need to be thought about. We then have a few pages on basic colour mixing, which is really helpful actually, mixing secondary bright colours and also mixing muted secondary colours. We have a really good selection on mixing neutrals. Contrary to what a lot of beginners might think, you will use more neutral colours, sort of more subdued colours in your work, especially if you're painting landscapes, than you will the brights. It's a little bit about optical colour mixing, which is where you paint one colour over the top of another, transparent watercolour, because there's the transparent watercolours and then the semi-transparent, then the more opaque watercolours. That gives you like a translucent stained glass effect and gives you a different colour. And then that brings us to choosing a palette, how to select and work with the colours for your needs. And this will obviously vary. Your palette that you choose will vary on the subject that you're selecting to paint and how you wish to paint it. And here is some helpful advice in your painting setup, how to choose the right equipment for whether you're painting inside or whether you're painting outside. And finally, in this chapter on basics, some advice on displaying your paintings, how best to present your work, the difference a mount makes, choosing the right frame and whether this should be glass or acrylic. This is a side note that says don't skimp on framing, nothing will hurt your painting more than a poor frame. So we now arrive at the main part of the book, which is watercolour techniques, and this is divided into 3 sections: beginner techniques, intermediate and advanced techniques. In total, 45 different techniques are covered. The first technique is wet on dry, controlling brush strokes and edges. So when wet paint is applied onto dry paper or areas of dry paint, the pigment will spread less than if you apply paint on a wet surface. This gives you more control over your brush strokes and produces crisp edges, allowing you to achieve precise shapes, definition and detail. This technique is wet in wet, how to create natural blending effects. By applying paint to wet paper or into a wet wash, watercolour pigments will merge and blend together naturally in a way that no other paint medium can achieve. This is really useful for painting skies or reflections in water. And in the book there are step-by-step demonstrations showing you how to use the different techniques, with call-outs actually highlighting details in the finished painting. I think it's excellent the way this is done. Here we have an example of the dry brush technique, which is handy for painting broken marks, such as painting the sparkle on water. And there's two examples here of using a brush and pulling up quickly, and also splaying the bristles in a brush. Useful for painting trees as well. Here is an example of layering paint, building washes from light to dark. This is also known as glazing. And here is an example of alla prima, completing a painting in one session. It's a great discipline, encouraging you to be organised and to quickly find the essence of your subject through simplification. And here we have what's been called a showcase painting of beginner techniques. So we have call-outs illustrating in the painting techniques such as wet in wet, lifting out, using runbacks, balancing a composition, using salt, and wet on dry. I think it's really helpful to be able to look at an entire painting and actually notice or have it pointed out to you where the techniques have been employed. This is a lovely painting that helps you to understand tone. Tone is used to describe form and mood and refers to the range of values from black to white, darks, midtones and highlights. Now we arrive at the pages discussing using runbacks, incorporating accidental effects. If you're a beginner, you may have produced runbacks by accident, but with no understanding of how they occur. But you can use them to your advantage, such as the spray from a wave or rain falling from a cloud. Flat wash technique is all about applying smooth watercolour, and it's quite fundamental actually to mastering watercolour, so that the colours dry to an even tone. Flat washes can represent large areas such as sky or water and define architecture and other features in a landscape. They make a good base for adding details. Always remember that watercolour lightens as it dries, so always apply a darker wash than you think you need. A graduated wash fades as pigment becomes progressively diluted. This makes it especially effective for painting skies and indicating distance. If you look at the image on the right hand page, you can see how the very pale colours in the sky have all merged together to create a smooth blend. I do like this painting. There's hardly any colour in it, but it tells you so much. You can see that it's an estuary with boats. I think it's absolutely beautiful in its simplicity. This brings us to a variegated wash, which is mingling colours together. You can create fantastic backgrounds and stormy skies with this technique. Over the next few pages we have examples of using line and wash, which is combining watercolour with permanent ink. If you'd like to learn more about this technique, I've actually reviewed another book by a lady called Camilla Dambo Bricks, Ink and Wash Florals, and I've added a link in the description below this video to that particular book review for you. Here we have some helpful advice about painting straight edges, painting an even line. It's not always easy with a paintbrush. And here is an example of using the lifting out technique, which is removing pigment from your painting. This is a really good way of portraying dappled light. And here are some suggestions to create texture in your paints by using a natural sponge. And here are 2 pages all about correcting accidental mistakes, removing unwanted marks. I'm sure I'll be referring to these pages on more than one occasion. This brings us to the final showcase painting in the beginner techniques section of this book. There's a lot to take in, isn't there? So we've got techniques in this painting such as wet on dry, using masking fluid, lifting out, dry brush, wet in wet and tone. And this painting is by an artist called Julia Tricky, Fading Hydrangea Study. I think it's lovely, don't you? This brings us to the intermediate techniques section, and we're starting off with a granulated wash. These are effects with grainy pigment. So when the pigments in your paint separate and clump together, they create this speckled effect, and this is what's called granulation. Here we have examples of a separated wash. So properties of certain pigments react when mixed with others to create an effect known as a separated wash. The reactions vary from a granulated texture to patterns caused by restricted bleeds. You can use these natural reactions to your advantage. They create mottled effects for skies and water, or detailed patterns such as animal markings. The next few pages are all about softening edges and making decisions about edges. If you use mainly soft edges, it will draw attention to the more defined features in a face, for example. And in a landscape, it creates illusion and mystery. Here we have 4 examples of splattering. We've got splattering on dry paper, splattering on wet paper, splatter with white gouache, and splatter and spritz. I've not met anybody yet who uses watercolour who doesn't like to do a bit of splattering. Here is some helpful information about using masking fluid. This masking fluid helps you preserve the white and light areas in your work. Sometimes it's known as liquid frisket. Masking fluid is a water-based medium used to repel paint and preserve the white or light areas on the paper. Very useful for creating small or complex details that would be too difficult to paint around. It can also help you produce some unusual effects that would just be impossible to do by hand with just a brush. Another fun technique is using wax resist. You can use wax crayons, candles and oil pastels. They can all add elements of colour and texture to your painting. When I was a little girl at school, I remember doing something similar, painting fireworks with coloured wax crayons, and then we covered it all over with a dark indigo wash. I was really proud of it and I thought it was magical. When painting with watercolour, natural and dramatic light effects are usually best achieved if you leave areas of white paper untouched rather than adding white pigment. And these 2 pages give you tips on how to put this into practice. This showcase painting illustrating the intermediate techniques is by an artist called Chris Robinson, and it's called By the Thames at Old Ilsworth. The painting is actually 15 by 22 inches. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I'm a big fan of Impressionist style painting and I just love this. So we've got illustrated here the use of warm and cool colours, negative spaces, a graduated wash, softening edges, a balanced composition and splattering. These showcase paintings are really helpful with these call-outs because it actually zooms in on the area where these techniques have been used and you can really learn from studying them. Here we focus on repetition, composing with shape and colour. Repetition simply means to feature an element, shape or colour more than once, and this is a powerful technique to create interesting paintings, sort of an abstract type painting which is quite popular at the moment in watercolour. Repeatedly painting motifs like this also helps to improve your brushwork. So on those days when you're not sure what to paint, why not take the opportunity to experiment with something like this? In the description below you will find 2 links to 2 other book reviews I've done. One is Creative Abstract Watercolour by Kate Rebecca Leach and the other one is Painting Calm by Inga Buvidavici. I'm sure I've pronounced that incorrectly, but both of those books actually focus on this particular type of painting. The next few pages focus on creating balanced composition. A good structural composition will engage the viewer. You have the rule of thirds, and then you have another technique is to use alphabet letters such as L, V and Z, C, T and S as compositional shapes. Here we have a couple of pages helping us to make better use of negative spaces. These are things such as the sky behind a wood or gaps in trees. This brings us to several pages about colour. So we have analogous colours. These are colours that harmonise and they sit next to each other on the colour wheel. When used together they create a calm and harmonious feeling, and they can also be used to bring life into a solid colour by varying the colour as you paint, such as in this painting of pansies. Complementary or contrasting colours can be used for visual effect. They sit opposite each other on the colour wheel and naturally enhance one another. Here is an example of complementary pairs and the visual effect this creates. The colours in your paint palette can be divided in many ways. and colour temperature is one that you can use to influence the composition. To create the illusion of distance and depth on the flat paper surface, artists need to simulate the natural effects of the atmosphere, which is known as aerial perspective. Here are some examples of how you can achieve this. Glazing is a very useful technique. It will enable you to adjust small areas or large areas of tone. It involves laying one thin wash or glaze of transparent colour over another dry layer of paint, either to build colours from light to dark or just to interact with the underlying colour to create a colour mix. This is the final showcase painting for the intermediate technique section. This has been painted by an artist called Eleanor Hardiman, and it's called In the Grass. The original painting was 22 by 30 inches, and we have the call-outs, this time highlighting layering paint, using masking fluid, repetition of marks, flat wash, balanced composition and complementary colours. We've now reached the advanced technique section of this amazing, incredible book, which is just jam-packed with so much information, and we're only halfway through. You might like to go and grab yourself another drink. So the first technique discussed in the advanced section is working in monochrome. This helps you to focus on tonal values, which is the fundamental structure of a painting. There's a saying, isn't there? Value does all the work and colour takes the credit. Drawing figures or complicated scenes can seem intimidating. If you break this down into simple shapes, you can create a convincing drawing in a contemporary graphic style. Here is an example of how to simplify a scene by eliminating details. Townscapes can tempt you to overcomplicate a scene and lose the freshness of the medium by adding too many details. The advice here is to look for a few main shapes and lines that direct the eye, and use tonal contrasts that emphasise the shapes and make them look three-dimensional without the need to add every single detail. Here are some really good examples of how to depict distance and three-dimensional space, such as one-point perspective and two-point perspective, illustrated by a beautiful worked example of two-point perspective by an artist called Ian Ramsey. And here is a beautiful worked example of adding shadows and sunlight into your paintings. This brings us to focal points, which are used to direct the viewer's eye. The focal point is the centre of interest in a painting, and it should not be too difficult to paint, and its position should clearly tell the story of a scene. This brings us to the first showcase painting in the Advanced Techniques section. The painting is by Ian Ramsey, and it's entitled Mountain Farm, Western Wyoming, and it's 18 by 24 inches. We have call-outs such as simplifying a scene, linear perspective, focal points, shadows and sunlight, using gouache and analogous colours. Scraping back or scratching at the paper's surface is a useful technique to remove layers of colour, create light shapes or add texture to a painting when a brush won't do the job. And here is a demonstration of how to create rippled and wrinkled textures using cling film, by applying the cling film to a wet wash and creasing it onto the wet paint. And unusual techniques such as using bleach and salt in this modern watercolour painting. In this example, the artist has used gouache to add capacity to colours and highlights. Here are several suggestions for using charcoal. You can create tone, you can wet the charcoal, you can add colour to it, and you can also use a charcoal wash. Inks can be used with watercolour, and they are super concentrated and more vibrant than standard watercolour paints. Their brilliant colours make them popular with illustrators, and here we have a beautiful worked example of an abstract floral. Watercolour pencils and pens contain a high concentration of water-soluble pigment. They are very versatile and a quick way to draw and paint, and give you a lot more control over fine details and marks than a brush and wash. Here is a detailed example of how to get various effects with gouache. There are some benefits to using gouache which is opaque. It adds body and texture to your paintings. Abstract paintings give you total freedom of shape, texture and colour. You can paint intuitively in the absence of clearly identifiable objects. Here is the final showcase painting for the Advanced Techniques section. It's by an artist called Maria Montiel and it's called Surreal Botanicals. It's 12 by 16.5 inches and it illustrates techniques such as wet on dry, towards abstraction, using salt and bleach, layering paint, watercolour pens and wet in wet. It's quite stunning, isn't it, the vibrancy of the colours. We've now arrived at the final section of the book, which is subjects, and we're going to look at landscapes and townscapes, patterns, still life and flowers, portraits, figures and animals. We begin with looking at woodlands and trees, giving a tree dimension and painting foliage. We then look at painting tree blossom, creating the effect of mass petals, using texture and variation of colour for a lively effect. In open landscapes, we learn how to evoke a sense of space using impressionistic techniques. Here we learn about abstracting a landscape. The key to abstraction is to simplify the composition and eliminate detail whilst retaining some elements of the landscape, such as sky, a hillside or a suggestion of foliage. This brings us to our first showcase painting in the subject section looking at landscapes. The artist is called Yong Hong Zong and the painting is titled Water Lily Reflections. It's 12 by 18 inches. So the call-outs are focusing on simplifying a scene, complementary colours, focal points, lifting out, linear perspective and dry brushwork. Over the next few pages we're looking at how to paint water, still water, reflections, ripples and shadows. So using soft wet in wet edges we can convey the shifting colours of reflections in water. And transparent glazes have been used to create the wonderful effect of the golden hour in Venice in this beautiful painting, capturing the movement and drama of waves. A crashing wave is so exciting to watch but difficult to paint because it only lasts for a few seconds. Here we're looking at painting a harbour scene. There is so much material to work with in a harbour scene. Colours and shapes of the boats, the rigging, reflective water, the mood by the weather. I have attempted to paint a harbour scene in the past and to be honest I failed miserably, so I'll be revisiting these pages at some point in the future and trying to do a better job. In Colours in Snow we learn how to paint white using colour. Like other white subjects, snow reflects the colours around it. Winter paintings are one of my most favourite subjects in a landscape painting. I'm fortunate enough to own a wonderful winter painting by the fabulous artist David Curtis. It's called Deep Snow in Missen. If you look closely there are a rainbow of colours in this painting. Here is an example of a different way to use white in a painting. This example is more of a graphic depiction and is called Bright Snow. With a little bit of thought and pre-planning you can capture street scenes and urban cityscapes. If you render the buildings in a recognisable way and use the street level bustle of people or cars, you can draw the viewer into the scene, or use a pared back style to record a building. I think this is a really lovely example of an urban abstract. A complicated urban scene can sometimes be daunting, but by simplifying it to the point of abstraction, this can be an accessible and exciting approach. Here we have a showcase painting of a townscape by a wonderful artist called Graham Booth. It's St Mark's Square in Venice and the original painting is 14 by 19 inches. The call-outs are showing us how to paint a group of figures, an example of using gouache, straight edges, softening edges, focal points and linear perspective. We're now going to look at patterns, still life and flowers in the subject section. Here is some advice to help you create a successful pattern design. Experimenting with various pattern designs is a really good way of practicing your brush control and your watercolour techniques. There is no pressure to create a masterpiece and it's very relaxing, and the final paintings can either be framed or incorporated into cards. When composing a still life, we need to think about the effect of lighting. The strength, direction and brightness will create shadows. Here, various techniques are illustrated for creating aged surfaces. Here is a showcase painting of a still life by an artist called Michelle Eiling. It's entitled Garlic, Lemons and a Lime and is 16.5 by 27 inches. The call-outs are illustrating shadows and sunlight using masking fluid, wet on dry, highlights, splattering and complementary colours. If you're interested in botanical painting, the next few pages are for you. Here is some excellent advice showing us how we can depict plant life accurately. And here are some techniques to help you paint your flowers in a more loose painterly way, using fluid washes of colour. This brings us to the final section of the final section, portraits, how to paint people and capture a likeness. Here is some advice on choosing a pose that's interesting and relatively easy. I love the way this portrait has been painted, it's so delicate. Here we have very useful information on colour mixing to achieve various different skin tones, accompanied by a lovely example of how to paint a portrait by using a slow build-up of transparent washes. And for something slightly different, how about an expressive portrait using contrasting bold and subtle colours? An expressive portrait will allow you to be free and experimental with colour rather than trying to describe reality. This is a beautiful showcase painting by an artist called Denise Finley and it's entitled Balanced. It's 11 by 17.5 inches. This luminous portrait combines a striking composition with a soft, delicate approach. The call-outs are highlighting, a balanced composition, tone, lifting out technique, negative spaces and softening edges. Here is some practical advice for painting a single figure in a pose setting to create an entire composition. Many artists avoid putting people in their paintings, but a few figures can make your paintings come alive. Compared to traditional figure painting, fashion illustration allows you to develop a more abstract, simplified approach to a pose. This is something that I know only too much about, having been a fashion illustrator in a previous life, but that's a story for another time. But if you really can't wait and would like to torture yourself a bit more, check out my YouTube channel progress vlog, episode 5. Here is some helpful advice about including incidental figures in a landscape. Figures demand our attention naturally. This is well known in marketing. If you include a figure or eyes in a photograph, people can't help but look at it. We've now arrived at the final showcase painting in this incredible book. The painting is by an artist called Gilly Marclou. It's called The Swimmer and it's 13 inches by 18.5 inches. The call-outs are illustrating where the artist has used masking fluid, layered paint, lifting out, focal points, wet on dry and variegated wash. When looking at this painting, I can really feel the water and imagine what it was like. And we mustn't forget about pet portraits, capturing the unique character of somebody's pet. I always admire artists that can do this because whilst all Labradors or Border Terriers might look the same to you, if you've ever been lucky enough to share your life with one of these amazing companions, I can assure you they all look very different and they have different characters. Using rapid strokes and loose wet-in-wet mixes, you can reflect the immediacy of a moving subject and capture wildlife creatures in motion. Isn't this painting of a hare just wonderful? We've now arrived at the final showcase painting in this incredible book. This painting is called Puffins and it's by an artist called Julia Cassells. The original was 20 by 28 inches. The callouts are showing how to use highlights, a balanced composition, wet in wet, glazing, line and wash, and using inks. It's just incredible, isn't it? We've now reached the end of this extremely detailed and comprehensive book. This is the glossary that describes all the terms that have been used within the compendium, and we have an index, and then we have 2 pages about the artists who have been featured in this book, with a little bit about them and links to their websites. Well, if you're still with me and haven't died of boredom or gone off to watch some paint dry somewhere, well done. It's been quite a marathon, hasn't it? It has taken me several days to narrate this book, and I just can't get over the amount of information and detail that's contained within it. It could be 3 books, and perhaps even as many as 9 books, because there is so much information, and for the price of this book, it offers so much value for money. It's practically a whole degree course in a book. The book has very high ratings on Amazon, 74% 5 stars, and customers find this book provides useful guidance and lessons on watercolour techniques. They appreciate the clear explanations and easy to understand lessons. The colour accuracy of the book is also praised, making it a valuable reference for beginners. Overall, customers consider the book to be great value for money with beautiful illustrations. Even Tinker seems to agree. So I do hope you treat yourself and get yourself a copy. You won't regret it, I guarantee it. In the description below, I've put links to where you can buy a copy. I've also put links to Dorling Kindersley's website and YouTube channel and other social media channels. Plus I've added links to the other book reviews that I've mentioned during this review. I hope you found my review helpful. If you did, please give this video a like. It helps YouTube promote my channel to other people who are interested in art books. I try and post a new art book review every single week, so if you'd like to see more reviews from me, please subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. And if you found this review helpful, please leave me a comment below. I do reply to all comments. And if there's an art book that you'd like to see, let me know and I will do my best to review it for you. So thank you for watching, and until next time, happy painting.